Today, breaking news: the already devastating war in Ukraine has entered a perilous new phase, with concerns intensifying over Belarus's role and the possibility of a second front that could dramatically escalate the conflict. What has unfolded on the border between Belarus and Ukraine is not simply a matter of troop movements or military drills, but a strategic confrontation that risks destabilizing not only Ukraine but the entire European security order. For years, Belarus has been a key ally of Russia, providing territory, infrastructure, and political support for Moscow's war efforts, particularly since February 2022, when Russian forces used Belarusian land to launch an initial thrust into northern Ukraine. Ukraine's president has publicly stated that Russia continues to use Belarusian territory to strike targets deep inside Ukraine, including launching long-range drones and attacking infrastructure while attempting to bypass Ukrainian defenses. Reuters: this situation has forced Kyiv and its Western partners to confront a deeply troubling reality. Belarus may not be a direct combatant yet, but its involvement in the war could be far greater than officially acknowledged. Since 2024, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko ordered significant deployments of troops, rocket systems, air defense units, and other military assets to the border with Ukraine. Ukraine's authorities and independent analysts argue that these deployments are being carried out under the guise of military exercises, but in essence they bolster Russia's ability to threaten Ukraine from a new axis. Wikipedia: the context of these developments is critical to understand. Belarus and Russia have for decades maintained close political, economic, and military cooperation. For Putin, Belarus provides strategic depth and geographic leverage, as its western borders lie close to major Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. For Lukashenko, reliance on Moscow has deepened since the political crisis in Belarus following the disputed 2020 election, leaving him politically and economically dependent on Kremlin backing. This dynamic has blurred the lines between independent Belarusian decision-making and active participation in Russian strategic objectives. Atlantic Council: despite frequent claims from Minsk that it does not intend to enter the war, Belarus has repeatedly reinforced its border and increased its military posture. In August 2024, Lukashenko announced the deployment of nearly a third of Belarus's army to the Ukrainian border, including air defense, aviation units, and missile systems. Ukrainian officials described the concentration of Belarusian forces as a significant escalation, arguing that the buildup served to distract Ukrainian command and inhibit Kyiv's ability to press other fronts. Wikipedia: these troop deployments were significant not simply in size but in implication. Ukraine and its allies viewed them as part of a broader Russian strategy to open a second front in the north, forcing Ukrainian forces to divert attention and resources away from the intense battles in the east and south. Although Belarusian forces did not cross the border into active combat, the accumulation of troops near neighboring oblasts created a climate of uncertainty and strategic pressure on Kyiv's military planning. Wikipedia: the specter of a Belarus front has been discussed by military analysts and policymakers for years. Early in the conflict, Western commentators and strategic think tanks warned that Belarus could be drawn deeper into the war, potentially dragging NATO into a direct confrontation if hostilities spilled across its borders. These warnings were not speculative but rooted in observable patterns: joint military exercises between Russia and Belarus, expanding integration of command structures, and Lukashenko's repeated assurances that he would stand with Moscow against perceived attacks. Atlantic Council: one such example of this collaboration was the joint military exercise known as Zapad 2025, conducted in September of last year. These drills, involving thousands of troops from both Russia and Belarus, were described by officials as defensive, aimed at simulating responses to hypothetical threats. However, neighboring NATO countries, including Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, reacted warily to the scale and proximity of the drills, warning that they could signal preparation for offensive operations or at least serve as a rehearsal for more aggressive action. Defense News Plus one: at the same time, a series of incidents involving drones crossing from Belarus into neighboring NATO airspace added to tensions. Poland and Lithuania reported multiple incursions of Russian Shahd-type drones that Western officials said originated near Belarusian territory. Minsk insisted it had provided advance warning and that stray drones were merely off course, but the events underscored how easily a miscalculation or escalation could widen the war beyond Ukraine's borders. Cyrillic letter 4-5. For ver opeyel kratkoi s yerika a peler a veda a. The strategic importance of Belarus's territory cannot be overstated. Geographically, the Belarus-Ukraine border lies near key Ukrainian oblasts including Chernihiv, Zhytomyr, and Kyiv itself. This proximity gives any military activity from Belarus a potentially devastating reach. As early as 2022, when Russian forces first invaded Ukraine, they used Belarusian air bases and staging areas to push into northern Ukraine in an attempt to encircle Kyiv. While that offensive ultimately failed, it demonstrated how Belarus's involvement could dramatically change the scope and direction of the war. Wikipedia. From the perspective of Ukraine's leadership, the concern is not only Belarus's direct involvement, but also the possibility that Russia could exploit Belarusian territory to circumvent strong Ukrainian defenses. President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have cautioned that continued Russian use of Belarusian airspace and installations to launch attacks undermines Kyiv's ability to secure its western front. Such actions not only place Belarus at risk of retaliation, but also heighten the stakes for all parties involved. Reuters. Beyond immediate military maneuvers, the Belarus front has broader geopolitical implications. Western nations have long been wary of the conflict expanding beyond Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, fearing that a direct attack on a NATO member could trigger Article 5 obligations and draw the alliance into war. The Belarus question, therefore, sits at the intersection of regional security, NATO deterrence strategy, and the fragile balance that has so far prevented the conflict from erupting into a larger European war. Defense news. Compounding these tensions are domestic dynamics within Belarus itself. Belarusian opposition figures and dissident groups have actively opposed Minsk's support for Moscow's war, engaging in acts of sabotage against railway infrastructure used to transport Russian troops and material. This domestic resistance highlights that Belarusian society is not monolithic in its support for the war, even as the Lukashenko regime maintains close ties with Moscow. Wikipedia. Critically, although Belarusian forces have not launched a direct offensive into Ukraine in the way Russian troops have, the strategic ambiguity of their role continues to fuel fear and uncertainty. Analysts argue that the presence of Belarusian troops at the border, coupled with integrated military planning with Russian forces, means that in practice Belarus functions as an extension of Russia's Western military posture. This effectively places Ukraine in a position where it must defend against potential threats from multiple axes. Atlantic Council. At the same time, Belarusian leadership has publicly denied intentions to become an active combatant in the war. Lukashenko has repeatedly stated that Belarus would only enter the conflict if its sovereignty was directly threatened, yet these statements have done little to ease concerns, given the history of Belarus's cooperation with Russia and the depth of military integration between the two governments. The Kyiv Independent. The ongoing debate among strategic policymakers is whether Belarus's actions are primarily posturing or a genuine precursor to deeper involvement. For Ukraine's military planners, the risk cannot be ignored. The potential of a fully open front from Belarus would force Kyiv to redeploy troops from the critical eastern and southern battlefield, weakening its positions where some of the toughest fighting has occurred. Wikipedia. Western governments have responded to these developments with a mix of diplomatic pressure, sanctions, and increased military aid to Ukraine. NATO has bolstered its eastern flank, reinforcing defensive capabilities in neighboring countries and conduct frequent exercises to deter any direct conflict spillover. At the same time, diplomatic channels remain open, with Western leaders emphasizing the need to prevent the war from widening, while continuing to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Defense news. The humanitarian cost of this prolonged war cannot be overstated. Beyond the geopolitical chess game lies the suffering of millions of Ukrainians whose lives have been upended by years of conflict. Adding a second front in Belarus would only exacerbate that suffering, increasing displacement, destruction of infrastructure, and civilian casualties. It would also test the limits of international support and the resilience of Ukrainians fighting to defend their homeland. Sky News in conclusion, the emergence of what some analysts call a Belarus front in the Ukraine war marks one of the most dangerous junctures in this conflict. The combination of Belarusian troop deployments, strategic integration with Russian forces, joint military exercises near NATO borders, and the utilization of Belarusian territory for offensive operations all contribute to a situation fraught with risk. Every movement, every diplomatic signal, and every military decision has the potential to tip a fragile balance into a wider conflagration. The world watches with concern as the shadows of war stretch ever wider, reminding us that peace remains fragile and that the consequences of escalation are profound for Ukraine, for Europe, and for global security. Reuters.